Thank you so much, Dr. Dubey. It's our love and respect for you that has brought me here. We have always looked up to you for guidance. And thank you, Dr. Nityanand. It's a pleasure to meet you, and Dr. Saxena, after all these years, and many of you who want to see with a gap. Dr. Nityanand talked about the dominant thesis that it's when you have growth and you have money and then suddenly you wake up to environmental consciousness. But that's not how the ecological consciousness has grown. Among the earliest movements of our times was the Chipko movement. There had no money in those villages. But the women could understand, you destroy the forest, you're going to get a flood. You're going to get a landslide. The Alaknanda disaster of 1970 was the wake-up call. And now with everything that we are seeing, whether it is in Himachal or Uttarakhand, the people understand how ecology works. People understand how ecology works not only because they live in those ecosystems, but also because we've had narratives to give us our deep understanding. I mean, the very descent of the Ganga, where she's saying, I will come with so much force, I'm going to destroy the earth. So you will have to persuade Shiva with his locks, which is the forest of the Himalaya. With only that will protect you. Because our monsoons are so heavy. In 4 months, it's all squeezed together. And it's the Himalaya that actually create the monsoons. They break the force of monsoon winds and then pour down the water. And by witnessing what's happening, 1970 disaster, women immediately connected to deforestation. And they started to organize. Gora Devi was the first, but there was also a longer awareness. Because forests had always been managed as a commons, and as Tagore wrote so beautifully in his essay called Tapovan, that we are a forest civilization. We are an Aranya Sanskriti. Everything we know came from the forest. And then he goes on to say everything that we know came from the tribals. He pays them an honor. And in Tapovan, Tagore mentions so beautifully, he says, in the forest there's diversity. And it's from the forest we learn democracy. India is different from other cultures because other cultures put their learning in brick and mortar. They locked up their classrooms and their universities. In India, we went to the forest to learn. All our rishis went off to the Himalayan forest to learn. And goes on to say, it's in the diversity of the forest where every herb, plant, bird, insect is finding its place and living in harmony, that we learned democracy. That's why our democracy is different. It's about participation. It's about participation with other life. It's about protection of other life. It's not about power. It's not about domination. And I think those are very important issues to turn to in our times. So the forests had been appropriated when the British came, as so much else. I don't think you can understand the ecological crisis without understanding colonialism, because everything changed. We had no private property in land. Land used to be a commons, and there was usufructory rights. And the community used to recognize who's been farming this land. But it's when the British came that they just announced with the stroke of a pen, the soil and land of India is the property of England. And through that they created extraction of rents at the Lagan. Through that they transferred $45 trillion from India to England. But where did that money come from? It came from the lagan of the peasant. So here was the peasant paying in cash the average, 50% of the average. But some years were not average. But that extraction is what led to the famines. It's not that we weren't growing enough. Amartya Sen's book shows very clearly didn't have lack of rice in 1942. But all of it was being extracted. And in the year of famine, they made more money. The records are all there. So many books have been written on this. For the famine was the other side of the extraction of 45 trade. Yeah? And that's why when we talk about environmental protection in India from the perspective of the poor, we got to see that people are made poor through extraction. Because there are three economies. There's the nature's economy. Nature can go on very well without us, you know. We've only come 200,000 years ago. She's been creating life for billion years, you know. So 99.9% of the time, we've not been around. And the earth knows how to take care of herself. In fact, she created the conditions for our species to survive. We have a very narrow niche, in particular kind of temperatures, in particular amount of moisture. Most of the remaining part of human history, we have lived in what I would call nature's economies. We've lived with the land, we've lived with the forests, we've lived with the rivers, we've lived with the oceans. And as short a relationship as possible. Colonialism added to fossil fuels, making industrialism, changed that equation. So economies of sustenance then became market economies, industrial economies, commodity economies, which then turned the other two into just raw material suppliers. Nature as a raw material supplier of natural resources, and people as a raw material supplier of labor. Till that time, people were working to meet their needs. The Industrial Revolution changed it to selling your labor power for someone else to make profit. And all the constructions of their time really hide where the real value comes from, you know. That it comes from nature, or that it comes from the peasant who's growing the food, that it comes from the women who are working away silently to do most of the work on this planet. So the appropriation of the resources from the people is what has led to ecological poverty. Now just take simple fact of water. Till I was in my 20s, you could stop in every river and stream of this country and drink the water. You never had to be worried. Now all the way to Gangotri, they carry plastic water bottles. Some of the worst pollution in Gangotri and Yamunotri and Kedarnath and Badrinath are plastic water bottles. We can't even trust our sacred rivers at their very source because of the pollution. Now, if I have a clean flowing river, I don't need money for meeting my need for water. But my water is polluted, then I will never have the money to buy a plastic water for every time I'm thirsty. So ecological poverty then leads to a situation where the poor are condemned to subhuman living. And not only are they condemned to subhuman living, from what I watch is, they are constantly criminalized. You know, look at the Teliwalas. We wouldn't have an economy of food and vegetables without the Teliwala coming down your street. Or the street vendors. If you watch, how many people can afford to go to a restaurant, how many people go to the Teliwala for their chawal and rajma? Yeah? Just count. I mean, it's an important study for whoever can do it to do it. So what happens is, and Dr. Mujkund Dubey has been such a big part of it, Dr. the years of the GATT and then the WTO were really years of criminalizing the economies of the poor. Just two examples. First is seed, that's what I do, that's the work of Vandana. And I would, I've left with some of our young friends the invitation cards for our Bhumi festival, which is on 1st of October in the auditorium. And we hope you'll be there because we are dealing with climate change and the future of food, which has become both the topical issue on food but the topical discussion in climate change in a strange kind of way. When I wrote the book, Soil Not Oil, it was always blushed to say, no, agriculture has nothing to do with it. Agriculture has nothing to do with climate change. Agriculture. Don't raise these issues, it's irrelevant. Oh, we'll just do renewable energies and everything will be fine. And overnight, agriculture as a whole, not industrial agriculture which causes the problem, but agriculture as a whole is, what is done to seed is being undone to farmers. You don't deserve to exist. With a very, with a pseudoscience that's not at all ecological. I won't spend too much time on it, and you can come on first because we'll have very, very good speakers to discuss it. Before GATT and globalization, we managed to pass environmental laws in this country. After Chipko, we passed the Forest Act. After Bhopal, we passed Pollution Acts. You know, every disaster, sadly, is what led to the environmental protection laws. We also had laws internationally, the Earth Summit. Earth Summit was 92. And many of us were saying, why do you have a fragmented environmental governance? You know, ozone sits in Montreal, climate sits in Bonn, toxic sit in Geneva. It should all come under one institution. Elevate the environment program, UN environment program, to, like you have a World Food Program, like you have a Food and Agriculture Organization, make it an environment organization. We were always told, no, there's no money for a new institution anymore. And 3 years later, they created the WTO, the money was all there. The Convention on Biological Diversity that was negotiated at the Earth Summit, along with the Climate Treaty, and they were really side by side because the biosphere and the atmosphere and the climate are related. And India played a leading role in both, something that's totally forgotten. Because our own people don't want to admit the positions they took at that time. Sovereignty was a very, very important position. Went into Article 3 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the Climate Treaty was very clearly, emissions, there's one group of countries that are the polluters, they must absolutely limit their emissions, and the polluters must pay for the damage they've already caused. You don't see those words now. Polluter pays has become loss and damage. And the polluters have become charity givers, and they just don't give enough money. Just India's disasters one year were 97 billion. And of the 100 billion, I think they've given about 40 or 50 billion. But even one disaster in one country can't be taken care of that. The main thing is you must pay because you're a polluter. That's an environmental principle. The Convention on Biodiversity had 3 components. The conservation of biodiversity, its sustainable use, and its fair share. And that's the basis of our Biodiversity Act. I know there will be a very long session on the entire Biodiversity Act. I don't know how many of you have followed the fact that they started to amend this act earlier this year. And I presented to the Parliamentary Committee. So I will just share with you some of the notes I submitted at that time, because I was part of the team, collective, very large team that drafted the Biodiversity Act. The preamble of the Biodiversity Act is an act to provide for conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the use of biological diversity. And when I started this work, my assessment was about 70 to 80% of the Indian people live in a biodiversity economy, directly. Whether they're fisher folks, or they're farmers, or they're the tribals, but they live in a biodiversity economy. That was 70% of India. And the rights to that biodiversity, of course, was the right to the commons. The fair and equitable sharing was the last. A little bit of the history in the background. The United States had always wanted access. They wanted access to the world's biodiversity, and then the right to patent what they grab. You know, a very asymmetric system. That your resources should be a commons from where we can take. But once we've taken them, it should be our property for which you must then pay royalties. So it was like the old Lagan now becoming a beach Lagan. And we've been fighting it. We managed at that time, because I was very, very present and active at the Earth Summit. I'd go to the Arabs, and of course I was advising the Indian government, go to the Malaysians, work with the Ethiopians. And we managed to make the Act a Conservation and Sustainable Use Act. And the access bit under fair terms, with prior permission, was a third. This then led to the Nagoya Protocol. The Nagoya Protocol, as is admitted, is based on the Indian Act, because it had the conditions under which you will have fair and equitable benefit sharing. They're the first rights holders are the ones who have to give you permission. Yes, you can take this medicinal plant and make it a pharmaceutical drug. And then there was the whole obligation of how the profits from that had to be shared. When they made the amendment, the first para of the amendment is very misleading. It claims to implement the Nagoya Protocol, which is based on an act. And created an impression that something new had happened in the world, and therefore we had to change our laws. It's violative of the Constitution, because our sovereign laws relating to biodiversity and knowledge are just being brushed aside. The preamble of the original Acts is where it is considered necessary to provide for conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing arising out of the use of genetical agriculture, and also to give effect to the said convention. They made the convention disappear. It's now just the Nagoya Protocol, you know, without the other obligations of the convention. Many subtle changes that will have very far-reaching. I've talked to lawyers that we should challenge it because it is violative of the Constitution. The word biodiversity is what the Act is about. They've turned it into resources. Because under the definition of resources, it's a raw material to be exploited. It doesn't have any intrinsic worth. The amendment has made the primary law of the convention a subsidiary to its subsidiary protocol, the Nagoya Protocol. It changed the meanings and added clauses. It added a section 2A, bringing access means collecting, procuring, possessing any biological resource. The rights holders, which is the communities, have been turned into benefit claimers, begging favor from the pirates. Give us something. And because I've been working on seeds and farmers' rights, and we drafted the law on farmers' rights in this country, and part of what we resisted was we showed, you know, Chaturanan Mishraji used to be the agriculture minister then, and he used to hear us, and Shuklaji was the GATT ambassador. He managed to put sui generis in the TRIPS agreement, Article 27, 3B, and sui generis is what allowed us to make our Farmers' Right, Plant Variety and Farmers' Rights Act. And part of it was we were showing that farmers had been the breeders, you know. From one grass they turned 200,000 rice varieties. Mango, thousands of varieties. Banana, thousands of varieties. Wheat, thousands of varieties. They're the first breeders and they have rights. So we put in Article 39 that farmers' rights to save, exchange, breed, sell seed can never be alienated. Very important clause, because the Pepsi threat of 4,000 crores to 4 farmers, it was only undone by this Article 39. I sent our book. No, the judges and lawyers didn't know about this act. I sent our book to the lawyers fighting the case for the farmers. And then, of course, once they read this out, the judges told Pepsi to withdraw their case, otherwise it would have to be dismissed. So we got rid of the colonial vocabulary in the seed system, which used to talk about farmers' varieties, not as evolved through breeding, but as folk varieties, as land races, as if the 200,000 rices just popped out of the ground without any work or breeding by the farmers. They brought that back into the clauses. New clauses have got added. So GA, GC. The amendments seem to be more legalizing and facilitating biopiracy and promoting intellectual property rights of global cooperation than defending the rights of people, for which this act was made. And we were fighting biopiracy. In fact, the act was so strong for fighting, its main objective was prevent biopiracy. Our biodiversity collections are our national heritage. Now, we have the traditional knowledge library, but the traditional knowledge library is merely digitalizing the printed word, which is there in the Health Act. But our seeds are not documented, they're in the farmer's field. So you've opened the floodgate. The traditional knowledge digital library will not prevent the pirating of farmers' varieties. And I have fought cases of biopiracy. I fought the case of neem, I fought the case of basmati. They patented basmati. The ancient Indian wheats they patented, Monsanto patented. Yeah? So it's not that they will not, they've proven that that's what they do. That's, in fact, you take imperialism and colonialism, its whole history is piracy. Pirate the land, pirate the biodiversity, pirate the knowledge. Even smallpox, there's so much literature. The doctors, they came here and found that we used to have a whole system of variolation, where house to house, variolation used to be given. From the cows they used to take, and nobody used to get smallpox, because there was vaccination. They found that out, read it in the Royal Society, worked on a vaccine, forbade the traditional practice. There was a lovely person called Dr. Dharampal who brought a lot of this out in the proceedings, in science and technology of the 18th century. It's all there. Steel making, shipbuilding, we were the big shipbuilders, made it in. You take it and then make it illegal. Take it from the farmer and say, no, you can't save your seed. And we are having to help people all over the world. Just now, Honduras, big fight going on, they're trying to change the law. All of Africa, they're making it illegal for farmers to save seed. Every day these things are happening. But we enshrined our law, in our law, that farmers have rights. So our national collection is a biodiversity heritage. And we've made laws, and so many people in the room have played a big role. So many meetings in this room have shaped this. Article 3D, which basically says trivial changes is not an invention in the medicine side. And Article 3J, and I feel grateful that I had a role in this, that if we are truly Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the earth is our family, then our relatives are not our inventions. We do not invent cows and plants and rices. And that's why Article 3J says plants, animals and seeds are not human inventions. This is why Monsanto never had a patent on the seed, and it lied its way, collected royalties from the seed companies. And I know they will not rest, because they brought it, they challenged in High Court, they lost, they challenged it in Supreme Court. And I remember good lawyers, good friends of ours, standing there as Monsanto's lawyers and saying, The seed is an empty container. It's what we do with the chemicals we put into it that make it a Superman and do things like this. And that's why we answer about that. Fortunately, we had good lawyers too. And they wanted to strike down 3J. It was never struck down. Of course, the media was in their hands. You know, Monsanto won. No, Monsanto didn't win. Because they had set their eyes on destroying 3J. The entire framework of the Constitution is being undermined in this law. I'm spending more time on it because it's a law I've shaped. It's a law whose dismantling I've tried to work on. But the same thing is happening with the forest laws, exactly. And you know, here the farmers get affected, there the tribals get affected in a direct way. Now, Article 6.3 changes the fact that any amendment to the Biodiversity Act would be enacted by Parliament. They've changed it and said, the National Biodiversity Authority shall, with the approval of the central government, make the regulations to provide for access to biological resources and associated traditional knowledge, and for determination of fair and equitable trade. Nothing about the rights of people, nothing about sustainable use. Access comes first. The corporate rights for invasion comes first. And the National Biodiversity Authority will change regulations and make amendments. Parliament is totally bypassed. So that too is a reason it should be challenged. Yeah. The rights holders are the communities who conserve and use the biodiversity, who have the knowledge. And their consent is first, even in the Nagoya Protocol, that consent is vital. And the Biodiversity Act is the legal recognition. But associated with it are all the other acts. There's PESA, there's the Forest Rights Act, and all of that will get impacted. Article 21 of the original Act had talked about the rights of local communities in fair and equitable sharing. And it had talked about approval of local bodies and the benefit claimers. The amended Section 21, very significant. The Section 21 says the approval will be given by the Biodiversity Management Committee represented by the National Biodiversity Authority sitting in Chennai. And till now, till December, it was scientists from biodiversity who used to be the chairpeople. From this year onwards, it's become a bureaucrat from the Ministry of Environment. So it's become a central government authority rather than a biodiversity authority. And even the local people are now to be represented by that centralized authority. We were a decentralized republic. And the biodiversity issue is what puts it totally at the center. And this biodiversity, we are a biodiversity republic. By undermining this law that articulates it, it's violative of 8J because the whole knowledge of the people who hold this biodiversity. And this at a time where we have all the evidence that 4 companies control the commercial seed supply. We've had piracy of neem, piracy of melons, piracy of atta, piracy of climate resilient, the list goes on. So we are at a very fragile moment, both for our constitution as well as our environmental laws and the rights of the people. And it will take a lot of mobilization, it will take a lot of reflection, it will take a lot of solidarity, it will take a lot of new ways to organize, to be able to defend the rights that are in the Constitution and our laws, not allowing an undoing, but in fact a strengthening, because the world at this point of collapse, extinction, needs stronger laws, not diluted and laws for deregulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.